Hello guys, I'm Amia and today we're going to talk about sentences. So first we're going to look at four types of sentences which are affirmative, interrogative, exclamatory and imperative sentences. After that we're going to look at cleft sentences which are mainly it-cleft and wh-cleft. Then moreover we are also going to move on to three kinds of sentences which are simple sentence, compound sentence and complex sentence. So let's move on to the four types of sentences. So first let's look at affirmative sentence. Affirmative sentence is a sentence that states a fact. They are simple statements or sometimes they declare, state or assert something. For example, Priya is a student. She lives in a big city. Now next look at interrogative sentence. An interrogative sentence is a sentence that asks a question. For example, what is your name? Where do you live? Why are you late? Now exclamatory sentence. Exclamatory sentence is a sentence that expresses sudden and strong feelings. It could be a surprise, wonder, pity, sympathy, happiness or gratitude. For example, what a shame. Oh, am I tired? I'm glad you came today. Like that. Now fourth type is imperative sentence. An imperative sentence is a sentence which gives command, suggestion, or it could be a sentence that make a request or express a wish. For example, go to your room. Please lend me your book. Have a good time at the picnic. I think blue looks better on you. These are imperative sentences. Now next, let's move on to cleft sentences. Cleft sentences is a grammatical construction with information broken into two clauses to provide extra focus to one piece of information. Usually, there are it-cleft sentences and wh-cleft sentences. An example for it-cleft is it was his voice that I loved. Wh-cleft sentence example is what I want is something to eat. So let's look at it-cleft sentences. So the pattern of it-cleft sentence is it plus to be verb plus highlighted word or phrase plus that or who clause. Let me explain with an example. So an example is John stole a book from the library last week. Now in this sentence, if we put subject as focus, then the sentence will be like, it was John who stole a book from the library last week. Now instead of John, if you are going to mention a thing or like some object, then instead of who we will write that. So let me state the sentence once again. It was John who stole a book from the library last week. Now when we put object as focus, the sentence will be like, it was a book that John stole from the library last week. Now when we put time as focus, which is last week, the sentence will be like, it was last week that John stole a book from the library. Now when we put our focus on place, that is library, then the sentence will be like, it was from the library that John stole a book last week. Or it was the library that John stole a book from last week. Now let me state some more examples. I did everything, not him. It was me who did everything. I can't stand horror movies. It's horror movies that I can't stand. Now let's look at what-cleft sentences. The pattern of what-cleft sentences is, which is wh-cleft sentences is, wh clause plus to be verb plus highlighted word or phrase. The wh generally starts with what. Apart from what, it can also be who, when, where, why. But instead of that, we're going to focus more on what. So in order to focus on a word or phrase, the sentence will be like, what I ignore about him is his rudeness. So here, the phrase that we are focusing on is his rudeness. Next pattern is what plus subject plus to be plus infinitive clause. In order to focus on an action, the sentence will be like, what John did yesterday was steal a book from the library. So here we are focusing on the action, steal a book from the library. Now let's look at the next pattern, that is what happens plus be plus clause. So in this pattern, to focus on a whole sentence, the sentence will be like, what happens is we always end up having a row. So we always end up having a row is a complete sentence, and we're going to put more emphasis on this complete sentence by writing it as what happens is we always end up having a row. Now let's look at other cleft sentences. For example, like giving more emphasis on a person. The person who told me about it was Mike. Now giving more emphasis on thing. The thing I want is a cup of tea. Or all I want is a cup of tea. Something I want is a cup of tea. One thing I want is a cup of tea. Now let's put some emphasis on time. Then the sentence will be like, the year when I graduated from university was the most difficult time of my life. It wasn't until I met him that I knew how modest he was. Now let's put emphasis on reason, and the sentence be like, the reason why I fell out with her was her extreme rudeness. Now let's look at two more examples. First sentence is, when I entered the room, I noticed they were about to celebrate my birthday. It was only when I entered the room that I noticed they were about to celebrate my birthday. Now I didn't know how modest he was until I met John. It wasn't until I met John that I know how modest he was. Now let's move on to three kinds of sentences, which are simple sentence, compound sentence, and complex sentence. A simple sentence has one independent clause, one subject, and a verb. For example, I live in San Francisco. I live in San Francisco is an independent clause. There is a subject I and there is a verb live. Now let's look at compound sentence. Compound sentence contain two independent clauses that are joined together. For example, she works in the city, but she lives in the suburbs. She works in the city is an independent clause. She lives in the suburb is also an independent clause. Both of it are joined by using the coordinating conjunction but. You can make a compound sentence by joining two logically related independent clauses by using a semicolon, a coordinating conjunction, or a transition. Now let's look at the point of using a semicolon. Independent clause, semicolon, and an independent clause. I love living in the city, semicolon. There are so many things to do. So I love living in the city is an independent clause. There are so many things to do is also an independent clause. Now let's look at the sentence using a coordinating conjunction. Independent clause, comma, coordinating conjunction, then independent clause. He couldn't watch the show, so he decided to tape it. He couldn't watch the show is an independent clause. Along with that, we'll put the coordinating conjunction, which is so. After that, we'll put another independent clause, which is he decided to tape it. Now, let's look at some coordinating conjunctions examples. In order to make a logical relationship, we will use addition, contrast, choice, cause, and result. And other type of coordinating conjunctions are and, but, yet, or, nor, for, so. Now let's look at a trick to remember it. And another way to remember this coordinating conjunction is fanboys, where F stands for, A is and, N is nor, B is but, O is or, Y is yet, S is so, which come together as fanboys. Now let's look at a sentence using a transition. A transition sentence consists of an independent clause, transition, and then again an independent clause. I love San Francisco, however, I hate the traffic. So I love San Francisco is an independent clause, and then we put the transition, which is however, and then we again combine it with I hate the traffic, which is also an independent clause. Now that's all about compound sentence. Now let's look at complex sentences. Complex sentences contain at least one independent clause and one dependent clause. For example, John cannot set up his typewriter. John cannot set up his typewriter because the wall has no outlet. So here, John cannot set up his typewriter is an independent clause because it's a subordinating conjunction, and the wall has no outlet is a dependent clause. Another example is, she will go to the school in the city until she finds a job. She will go to the school in the city is an independent clause until is a subordinating conjunction, she finds a job, which is in turn is a dependent clause. Now we can also use a comma after a dependent clause if it begins the sentence. For example, when I first moved to the city, comma, I was afraid to drive the steep and narrow streets. So we will first start with when. When is a subordinating conjunction. I first moved to the city. Here after that we use comma because the first part of sentence is a dependent sentence, and then comes the independent clause. I was afraid to drive the steep and narrow streets. So when I first moved to the city, I was afraid to drive the steep and narrow streets. Here when is a subordinating conjunction. I first moved to the city is a dependent clause with a comma. After that we'll write I was afraid to drive the steep and narrow, which is an independent clause. So I hope this session regarding sentence was informative to you all guys. So until the next session we can see again. Thank you.